Today's lecture is underwritten by the George and Julie Follansbee Family Fund. Shorty and Julie were deeply involved in Chautauqua their whole lives. Shorty missed one season when he was 13. They both served Chautauqua in numerous capacities, including as coordinators of the Sunday Ushers for nearly 50 years. The 8th generation of their family continues to be involved at Chautauqua. We thank the Follansbee family for their generosity, and we thank all who support the Chautauqua Fund. Our speaker this morning, Kristin Romey, covers archaeology and paleontology for National Geographic magazine and National Geographic News, and she is the former executive editor of Archaeology magazine. A fellow of the Explorers Club, Ms. Romey was one of the first Westerners to survey and excavate in the former Soviet regions of the Black Sea. With Archaeology magazine, her award-winning work has covered the globe, highlighting topics from Maya human sacrifice in the Yucatan to the legacy of Alexander the Great in Uzbekistan. Before joining the editorial team at National Geographic, Ms. Romey directed field operations for their multi-year archaeological expedition at Lake Aedicule in Kyrgyzstan, a place described as the Atlantis of the Central Asian Silk Road. Ms. Romey holds an AB from Vassar College and an MA from Texas A&M's Nautical Archaeology program. She is joined by 2 aunts and 1 cousin this morning on their first visit to Chautauqua. Her lecture is titled, Why Archaeology? Please join me in welcoming Kristin Romey to our platform this morning.
Thank you. Thank you. It's such an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here at Chautauqua. You know, I have family in Buffalo, and I would drive by once in a while. But I always meant to visit, but I never dreamed that my first visit to Chautauqua would be on this stage. And so it is a real pleasure and a privilege, and also to be able to share the human journey with such an engaged crowd. Thank you for welcoming National Geographic to Chautauqua this week. Thank you. It's also a real pleasure and privilege to be a writer at National Geographic. I mean, the amount of information that rolls through our newsroom and the amount of fantastic discoveries that are made by our explorers like Lee here, and the incredible research that gets done in the farthest flung corners of this earth are spectacular. And sometimes it borders on the surreal, and I want to write a book called Overheard at National Geographic, because this happens all the time. Just a couple weeks ago, I was sitting at my desk next to one of the editors, and she's on the phone, and she says, "Okay, so what breed of dog are we using to hunt for the remains of Amelia Earhart? And are they wearing booties and goggles on this deserted island, or just booties?" And it's moments like that where I'm like, how on earth did I get here? My own human journey, right? And I want to bring you to a moment on my human journey where one of the most important moments of how did I get here that happened to me recently was in October of last year, when I found myself in the tomb, what is traditionally considered to be the tomb of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. And this is a view taken from the top of the rotunda in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, looking down on a little building called the Aedicule, which is Latin for little house. This Aedicule houses what is traditionally believed to be the tomb of Jesus Christ. Now, National Geographic was brought there because what had happened, the Aedicule, which had been built around in the early 1800s, was falling apart. It had suffered from fires and earthquakes and water damage, and it got so bad that the Israeli government actually stepped in last year and shut down the tomb of Jesus Christ for 2 days because they were worried that this little building would fall apart. And the 6 religious groups, Christian religious groups that lay claim to the church, finally agreed to restore it. And National Geographic was the exclusive partner to watch them on this process. Now, this is a view in the inside of the Aedicule, where you see this marble bench where people are worshiping. Now, from our accounts in the New Testament, after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, his body is placed in the tomb of a wealthy Jew known as Joseph of Arimathea. Now, we know from archaeology at the time that in the 1st century, if you were a wealthy Jew in this part of the world, you would be buried in what we call a rock-cut tomb. These were essentially caves hewn from the rock, and along the sides of them were benches, or beds, we would call them, burial beds. And what would happen is that the family would lay out the body of the person on the bed, come back a year later, collect the bones, put them in a box. So in 326 AD, 325, 326, the first Christian Roman emperor, Constantine, sends a team to the Holy Land to find the sites associated with Jesus Christ. And they get pointed to a cave where they said this is where his body was put in. And so what do the Romans do? They essentially, in this diagram you could see, they lop off the top of the cave, so all you have left is this burial bed. And then they build a shrine around it, and later the shrine becomes a church, and then it becomes another church, and then the church is destroyed, leveled almost to the ground in 1009 AD. And then it's rebuilt again, because people keep coming back, because this is considered the most important site for the world's largest religion. And we were there for it. And so why were we even opening the tomb? The tomb was being opened because the conservators, and we had the best conservators in the world, these are the people who have restored the Parthenon and the Hagia Sophia, the only ones to be trusted with a site like this. They were not only, erasing centuries of soot from the exterior of this little Aedicule, but they had to go in and reinforce the building, which meant injecting grout. And what they didn't want to do was, if there was some part of this cave, if there really was still some part of this cave that was identified in 326 AD, if any of that was still somewhere in this building, they didn't want to get grout on the surface of what is known as the holy bed. So it meant it was time to open it up. And it was an incredible experience that we followed for months. And here you could see we have the leaders, the Greek patriarch, the Armenian patriarch, and the chief Franciscan of Jerusalem inspecting as the work went along. And I kept coming back to Jerusalem and following what was going on. And it was decided that the tomb would be opened sometime in October. And we weren't given a specific day because there was a big concern, because unlike the Western Wall in Jerusalem, or unlike the Dome of the Rock, there is no security measure at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There's no metal detectors, there's no security guards. And there was a concern that if and when this tomb was opened, that there would be a terrorist attack once the tomb was exposed. So everything was kept hush-hush, and we were told, come to Jerusalem end of October, and we'll give you 24 hours notification on when you need to be at the church. And be prepared to be locked inside of this church for 60 hours while the tomb is opened, inspected, and then closed back again. And because as far as we know, this tomb, this marble-clad bench, that marble cladding had not been removed in living memory. Most likely it had been put in place somewhere between 13 and 1500 AD and never, ever taken off. So we were going to be the first ones to see what was under this marble that was protecting this holy bed. And I recall sitting there with my team from National Geographic. We had our archaeologists in residence, we had our videographers, our photographers, and we were going through our checklists. We were like, do we have our backpacks full of granola bars? Do we have our sweaters for sleeping on the stone cold floor of the church while we're locked in for 60 hours? Do we have, is our camera equipment in place? Are we ready to go? Are we prepared for whatever may happen here? And we get up from the table, ready to walk to the church, and one of my team members turns around and he's like, all right, one more thing. Let's hope they don't find bones. But what did we find? We didn't find bones. So here's a shot from the top looking down on this marble burial bed when they're removing the marble cladding. And what we found underneath was another slab of rock. This gray, very thick slab, almost like 6 inches thick, and it had been shattered. And what we knew from looking at the iconography of the crucifix that was engraved on this stone, in the way that it had been broken, was that this stone was on top of this limestone bed before the church was destroyed in 1009 AD. That it had survived that. We're going back even farther now, that whatever is underneath here now has been going back at least 1,000 years. And what do we find after that? We find the original limestone of the cave. This is the original surface of the burial bed that was identified in 326 AD as the final resting place of Jesus Christ. And it's still there. It's still intact. It has survived. And it was a spectacular moment in a way, because it was, we had a small group of priests and nuns who were in the church. We had the conservators. Everybody was on tenterhooks. And then once that marble was lifted and people were able to go in and see, it's just a piece of limestone. But the resonance that this had for the community was absolutely remarkable. And I remember standing alone in the tomb after the cladding had come off, looking at this little piece of limestone and thinking, people had fought and died for this little piece of rock for almost 2,000 years. It's the resonance of place. It's the importance that we assign to physical monuments and little pieces of stone and the stories that grow out of them. And speaking of stories, then I got outside of the tomb and I sat against it with my cell phone and filed my exclusive story for National Geographic that went around the world. And I was thinking to myself, how on earth did I get here? And it's an interesting journey. It's not a direct journey for me. I did not grow up with dreams of being an archaeologist. I don't have any baby pictures that show me looking like a future archaeologist. I'm sorry. But I do have a picture that is what ultimately changed my life trajectory. This is Konstantin Malyevich's Black Square, if you're familiar, early 1900s. I went into college not knowing what I was going to do, so I decided to become an art history major. One day, this painting pops up on the screen, and the professor starts going on about, the Black Square and this seminal moment in art history. And me, being the Philistine that I am, thought, this is a black square. Then I thought, you know what? I don't really like anything that much after 500 AD. So I decided at that point that I was no longer going to be a history major. I was going to study the classics. So I switched to the classics department, and I began to study ancient Greek. And I discovered a world that I had no idea about once I was exposed to the writings of the ancient Greeks. I like their art too, but it was their writing that began to really wow me. We have some of the earliest accounts of exploration, of trying to figure out how we fit in this world and how on earth did we get here. These are coming from the ancient Greek writers. One of my favorites, Herodotus, 5th century BC historian. He wrote fantastic accounts of the world around him and trying to understand it. He wrote about the Persians and the Scythians and the Egyptians, and he would include these fascinating little facts that he observed about human behavior. For instance, Herodotus wrote, so with the Egyptians, if their pet cat dies, they shave off their eyebrows. But if their pet dog dies, they shave their entire head in mourning. Little facts like this, just observing how people are different all around the world and analyzing this. And what I also discovered was this whole subset of Greek authors that wrote what we call paraploi, which means go around. These are guidebooks to the oceans that they were aware of and their world. It says, you sail this distance along this coastline and you come to this city, and here's what's in this city. And then you go a little farther and you get to here, and this is what you should expect. It's almost like a AAA guide of ancient Greece. And they showed the extent of exploration that was being done back then. And I was fascinated. This is one of my favorites up here. This is Pseudo-Skylax from 330 BC. And he really got me hooked on exploration in the ancient world and trying to understand the world around them, what their perspective was on everything. I was about to graduate, and at that point, I was unsure whether or not what I wanted to do with a degree in ancient Greek. And I was like, do I still want to keep reading the same books and texts that people have been reading for 2,000 years? And then I had another life-changing moment. This was my post-Malevich moment, is that an archaeologist came to school and he lectured on a site that he was working in. It was a Roman harbor on the Israeli coast called Caesarea, and they needed volunteers. And as I was like, this might be interesting. You know, I could be reading the same book that everybody's been reading for 2,000 years, or I could go out and find new information about the ancient Greeks and the Romans and where they sailed and what they did and what they discovered. So I got certified in scuba diving, and I went to the site of Caesarea. I ended up working there for 2 seasons, and I was hooked. I was absolutely hooked. And that's what led me ultimately to go to graduate school in archaeology, an underwater archaeology, which oddly enough, the best school in the world for underwater archaeology is Texas A&M University. I am probably the only person you will ever meet who could both claim to be a Vassar girl and a Fighting Texas Aggie. I had a fantastic once I delved into archaeology and I understood the power of archaeology, I realized that archaeology is not history. History is written by the winners. History is written by the victors. History is written by the powerful. Archaeology gives a voice to the people that didn't have that power in the past. And it shows the importance and the details of everyday life and the fascinating aspects of human continuity, that we are still behaving the same way now that we were behaving 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago in so many ways. And one of the seminal moments I had when I first started at grad school was I discovered the Garbage Project. The Garbage Project is a monumental moment in archaeology because of what it revealed. This was in the 1970s. There was a professor from Arizona, and he decided to go around and ask people, okay, what do you eat? What do you drink? How do you manage your household budget? What kind of clothes do you buy? These sort of things. So he took those accounts that people told him about what they did, and then he went and looked in their garbage and found that it's a completely different story than what they tell you. For instance, I think people were underreporting their beer drinking by 60%. But this is the power of archaeology. It's not history. It's not what people want you to think about them. It's what they really are, right? And so once I realized this power, it was incredible. And I had incredible adventures in graduate school, and it was fascinating. I was working on shipwrecks. This is a 1,000-year-old shipwreck off the coast of Turkey. The level of preservation underwater is so good that we were pulling up sealed clay jars full of perfectly intact grapes, 1,000-year-old grapes from this wreck. It taught me about trade routes. It taught me about economies. It taught me about what people thought was valuable back then. You know, what was precious and what was everyday. This was this fantastic, fantastic new insight into the world that I had. And I was lucky enough to go straight from grad school to working at Archaeology magazine. But here, I discovered probably one of the important lessons I have learned as a science journalist, is we have a really bad feedback loop between scientists and the media. And it tends to go somewhat like this, because I see it happen all the time. In my case, an archaeologist will make some big discovery. The university will put out a press release, and all of a sudden, he or she has the New York Times and the Journal and the Daily Mail and all these news outlets calling him and reporting on the discovery. But very often in the general media, particularly if you're a journalist who does not know about the importance of polychrome pottery from late Helladic 3C Mycenae, you can't convey it correctly. And a lot of these accounts were, at the best, inaccurate. At the worst, they were sensationalistic. And that's fine for the general audience who doesn't need to know the details of late Helladic 3C Mycenae. However, then that archaeologist goes to a conference, and he or she gets ribbed by his or her colleagues. And then they don't want to talk to the journalists anymore. And so the good scientists stay away from the media, and then when something happens, the media goes to scientists who are not as scrupulous or that are outliers, and things get more sensationalistic. It's a negative feedback loop, and it's dangerous for scientific media. And what I discovered at Archaeology magazine was I could be the go-between. I had the knowledge. I knew what late Helladic 3C polychrome pottery from Mycenae looks like. But I also had the ability, I had the gift, to be able to translate that to a non-specialized audience in a way that was accurate and was compelling. And I did this for many, many years, and then I ended up going freelance for a while to learn the new world of digital media that was coming all around us. And it was while I was freelancing that I got really lucky. I got my next big break. I had a friend of a friend of a friend who thought that they may have an interesting site in a lake in Kyrgyzstan, in Central Asia. I did not know anything about Central Asia, really, especially underwater archaeology in Central Asia. But that brought me to Lake Aedicule. Lake Aedicule, which means warm water in Kyrgyz, is the second highest alpine lake in the world, the second largest alpine lake in the world after Lake Titicaca. It's fed by glaciers, but it has no outlet, and we don't know where the water goes. And because of that, the water levels change dramatically. And right now we figure the water levels are probably about 15 meters higher than they were centuries ago. This means that their towns and cities that were originally built on a shoreline are now underwater. And we have entire cities in this lake. One of the difficulties is that the Russians also have an underwater missile testing base on this lake, which means that during the whole Soviet period, it was closed. And even to this day, there are only certain parts of the lake that we could go to. But, we had the story that there's something in the lake, it's some sort of building, there's something odd about it, let's go. And we went there and we were like, this needs more investigating. And that's when National Geographic gave us money. to set up shop in a former Soviet young pioneer camp on the shores of Lake Aedicule in Kyrgyzstan and figure out what we actually had there. It was a fascinating experience. We were using high technology. We were using low technology. We had a specially built sub-bottom profiler that helps us see underneath the lake bed. We had a drone. You could see in the foreground we have a drone. In the background is a World War II era Soviet rangefinder that we used to map the site. But what did we find? We found this enormous building in the lake. And based on the design of the building, based on the radiocarbon dates we were getting back, and based on the brilliant blue tiles that we kept pulling up, we realized that the closest parallel to this building in this lake was in Samarkand. These were the official buildings of Timur, or Tamerlane the Great, one of the most accomplished conquerors of all time. He lived in the 1300s. He claimed to be descended from Genghis Khan, and he had excellent taste in architecture. But one of the problems now that we're struggling with after 5 years of excavating here, we've done our field work, everything is right now in the lab being processed, is we have to solve a mystery. And that mystery is, here's the empire of Timur in the 1300s. Right? Lake Aedicule is off, it's a tiny white dot in the upper right-hand corner, far beyond his empire. So what are we doing with an official Timurid building that far outside of his empire? And what we figure right now, this is our acting hypothesis, is when Timur died around 1400, he had been planning to invade China and march on Beijing. We think we may have a forward operating base for his planned invasion of China on Lake Aedicule. So we're still working on this, but this gave me my first opportunity with National Geographic. And I realized that I was not going to make the cover of National Geographic anytime soon with my shallow water excavation. But I did something even better. I got to work at National Geographic. And so they hired me on as a writer, and all I do is archaeology for digital and the magazine, and I have had the privilege of being able to write about the great discoveries of our explorers, like Sarah Parkak, who finds archaeological sites via satellites. And I also have the privilege to tell stories about the real power of archaeology too, which is not always in these spectacular discoveries, but it is in the tiny items of everyday life and what they tell us. And this has been the mission of National Geographic now since Hiram Bingham, with his expeditions to Machu Picchu in the early 1900s. He was the one who made National Geographic, in a sense, what it is today, because he came back with photos. And up until then, Geographic was a text magazine. There were no photos. There were a handful, but nothing spectacular. He came back, and with our April 1913 issue, we were on the road to what we are today. And it was because of archaeology, and it was about the wonder of discovering and exploring ancient monuments in far-flung worlds. But it's not, it's the monuments also, but we always have to start with the artifacts. And this is what I particularly love about archaeology, is this is the school homework of a little boy named Anfim. You see, it's a little doodle. He drew this school homework on a little piece of birch bark in Russia 750 years ago. 1260 AD, this. It's from a site called Novgorod, where we have thousands of these birch bark letters. And you know what they say? They say things like, "My mother-in-law is driving me bananas." They say things like, guess what? Don't forget, you owe me 20 rubles. I'm checking up on you. Human behavior has not changed, even though the idea of Russia in the 1200s seems so remote. They were writing the same love letters that we write today. Here's another one of my favorite ones. This is Pompeii. This is at the entrance to a house in Pompeii, right at the threshold of the door. And you know what it says? It says, Cave canem, which is Latin for beware of dog. Right? It's these connections that we forge through archaeology and the human journey that we could uncover through archaeology, which is so spectacular. And it's also understanding this need to revere sites, magnificent sites like Machu Picchu. People pay a lot of money to go there and stare at it with awestruck wonder. What is it about us humans that makes us do this? Right? What is it about us where we have such a drive to create physical monuments in our psychic landscape that brings people back to a Roman wall? This is the Western Wall for 2,000 years. And that's one of the most contested sites, in the world. This humble Roman wall, right? What is it about physical sites that makes a city like Rome retain its Colosseum for as long as it has? This could have been taken down, it could have been disassembled, stones moved everywhere, but every single generation of Romans made the conscious decision that this monument was going to stay because it represented their city. And that's what monuments do. They represent cities, they represent countries, they represent civilizations, they represent what we think is important about us. And there is that need to make the physical connection. That's why we have Plymouth Rock fenced off that you could go visit to this day. It is a rock. But the stories that this rock represents about our nation are so potent that we have decided that that rock is incredibly important and that it needs to be saved for future generations. And the difficulty of assigning such power to physical places and monuments is that they do have power over us. And people who want to actively harm cities and countries and civilizations, they know that. They know that. And this is why, we see what we do, because we have this human need to assign importance to ancient monuments. We have this human need to build a structure that we're going to take other objects that are not going to help us in any way but fill us with admiration and awe and understanding. And they know that. One of the most terrible events that happened very recently that broke my heart was the destruction of Al-Hadba. This minaret in the Iraqi city of Mosul had survived for almost 900 years. It was a symbol of Mosul. It was like the Eiffel Tower of Mosul, if you want to call it that, right? The Leaning Tower of Mosul, I've heard behind. And because it's got this quirky little lean, and it's had that quirky little lean since at least the 1400s, when a traveler that came through remarked that, they've got this minaret, and it's called Al-Hadba, it's a nickname that means the hunchback. And this was that already in the 1400s, Mosulis had lovingly nicknamed this monument the hunchback. And this was what represented their city. Sometimes they even called themselves the hunchbacks. It was kind of a short phrase, and it represented a city that was incredibly diverse and resilient, that had survived centuries of war and invasion, and that this minaret had survived along with it. And the Islamic State knew that. And so when they were retreating from Mosul, just a little more than 2 weeks ago, they knew that the biggest pain they could inflict on the citizens of Mosul as a group, as a city, was to destroy Al-Hadba. And we know from this is a still from a very grainy video of the moment that it was destroyed. And we know that the Islamic State had spent months carefully lining the interior of this minaret with explosives, because we could tell by the explosive patterns that this wasn't just like a last-minute thing. They had planned this because they know. They know. You know, and then there's other sites that are not deliberately destroyed, but that are also casualties of war. And I have a very personal one for me, and this is the site of Maram Bilqis in central Yemen. This is also known as the Moon Temple of the Queen of Sheba. It's from around 700 BC. Incredible, incredible temple with inscriptions and plaques that were written by donors that say, I hereby, give this building to the goddess, and beautiful sculptures of alabaster. And it was a remarkable experience to work there when I was working there, and to uncover a site like that was so preserved, pristine, in the desert. And also, just the experience of working in central Yemen, we were essentially in Al-Qaeda territory, was an interesting one too. And I just have to show these photos for you. This is one of my best buddies, Ahmed. Ahmed is a 12-year-old who likes Marlboros and Kalashnikovs. His is parked in the back there. So I worked with him. We were excavating one of the temple sites. This is the obligatory group photo of my excavation team. And if you could see, right in the center, right next to me, there's a guy holding a knife to the neck of another guy. And this is the Yemeni equivalent of bunny ears, I guess, in a photo, right? I don't know. But it was an incredible experience, and I came away with that site, realizing like this incredible importance to it. And that was in 2007. In 2008, Al-Qaeda detonated a car bomb right outside the site, killing 8 Italian tourists. And nobody has been back. And since then, Yemen has descended into war. And I could only watch from a distance. I don't know what's going on at this site. I don't know if there's any protection. I don't even know what the villagers think about it. All I could do is report from a distance. The Marab Dam, which was the dam that sustained this city for centuries and centuries, was hit by a Saudi airstrike. 1,000-year-old dam. 1,000 BC, roughly, 700 BC, destroyed by a Saudi airstrike. And now I have to report this from a distance from a newsroom in Washington, D.C., on my sites. Right there, yeah. This is the kind of stuff that I have to report on. And on top of talking and making people aware of the impact and the danger of monuments being victimized, we also have to talk about looting at National Geographic, which is the artifacts that are wrenched from their archaeological sites without any context, and we lose an incredible amount, a noble amount of information. This is Sheshep Amun Teyezer, her coffin. She lived about 2,600 years ago. This sarcophagus was illegally looted from Egypt, cut into 4 pieces, and FedExed to the United States to be put on display in somebody's living room. So National Geographic also partners with Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs to find these items and get them back to their home countries. So Sheshep Amun Teyezer is now back in Egypt because of our work with the federal government. But we do have to bear witness to this and realize what an impact that looting is having, on our understanding of the human journey and human society. For instance, this is a satellite map of a site in Syria before the Civil War. This is a satellite map right now, and all those tiny little holes are looting holes. So here, I'll show you again. That's the site before. That's the site now. So we do have to bear witness to that, and that's what National Geographic does. Right? We write about this. We make people aware of what the collateral damage is when somebody takes an Egyptian sarcophagus and puts it in their living room. So I've also worked with Homeland Security on some of these busts, so to speak. And one of the incredible ones that I was on was a It was a warehouse on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and in the course of one day, we recovered over $100 million worth of Asian antiquities that were just in storerooms. They were owned by a dealer who had a gallery on Madison Avenue, and he had stuff like this. And what he did was he had a book with photographs of these incredible statues. And you would go into his gallery on Madison Avenue, and you'd point at the one you want on the book. And he'd be like, okay. And he picks up his phone, he calls his buddies in Sri Lanka or in India, and they go to the temple and steal it. Fake the papers, and then send it over to the US. This is what happens, and this is what we bear witness to. And it was actually this very Homeland Security agent, I was with him in this building. This is a building in an unknown location in New York where they store all of these artifacts that are collected from these raids, trying to figure out how to get them home. And he's like, I got something to show you. And he takes me into the room, and there, against one wall, are hundreds of these alabaster heads. These are from my site in Yemen, all sitting in a warehouse in New York City because somebody decided that it was, easy to loot the site and somehow get them to the US where people could put them in their living rooms. Right? But there is an upside to all of this, is that this technology that we're using now to monitor the looting is technology that we could also use for exploration. So it's exploration and preservation. And it's technology that's being developed by our explorers like Shah, who you saw yesterday. Right? It's, for instance, like this is a satellite image taken from space by our explorer Sarah Parcak in Petra. Petra in Jordan is a site that has been excavated for ages. Everybody thinks they know everything about it. But they actually found that this is an entire temple, previously unknown, detected from space. Not an archaeologist on the ground noticed it, but you can see it when you have that perspective. We have remote sensing technologies that enable us to find shipwrecks. Like this one, this is the bell from a ship from the fleet of Vasco da Gama. This is the earliest shipwreck from the age of exploration that we have. Funded with excavation, was funded by National Geographic. I was lucky enough to work on this too. But this is remote sensing technology that found this wreck. This chart, this is the results of the sub-bottom profiler I use in Kyrgyzstan to find this building that belongs to the Timurid Empire. Right? This is ground-penetrating radar. It's kind of pulled along like a little pet dog. But it allows you to see underground, and you could use it to find ancient Egyptian tombs. You could also use it on the tomb of Jesus Christ to find out how much of that original cave that was identified in 326 AD is left. This is the technology that we have. Lee is absolutely right. We are in a new age of exploration. We are in the golden age of exploration because of this technology and the importance of these stories that we could tell. This is one of my favorites. This is LiDAR. LiDAR enables you to see through vegetation. So you have the vegetation on the left, you have what the results are on the right. We are finding entire civilizations in the Amazon that we had no idea existed because now we have LiDAR. And we could tell these stories of the human journey in such a way that helps us figure out how on earth did we get here? How did this journey begin? Where is it going? What are we doing? And archaeology is so critical to understanding that. And that's why it's such a critical component of National Geographic too. And what we do here to not only explore and report, but then to inspire the next generation of explorers and reporters. And I'll close with a little story here. There was a couple weeks ago, I get an email from somebody at the society, and they're like, we've got this woman, she's a subscriber, and her daughter wants to be an archaeologist, her young daughter. And her daughter's got a birthday coming up. Would it be at all possible if, you being a female archaeologist, can you just sign this birthday card for us? Maybe give her a little bit of advice? And I did, right? I'm happy to. 2 days before I came here, I get this photo. This is Ava's birthday cake for 8. She's excavating in it. Oh my gosh, this rocked my world. There are even tiny little fondant National Geographic magazines on the surface of the strata that she's excavating. And it's these kind of moments. I want Ava in 2017 to be the person who finds that next piece of homework from Anfim 750 years ago. And I think with the mission that Geographic has to tell the story of the human journey and to be able to share that with you, I think she's going to do it. Thank you.
As always, for those who are needing to leave a little early during our Q&A session, please be as quiet as possible out of respect for those who are joining us for the next several minutes. Kristin, you are both a journalist and an archaeologist. And my question is, are there times, or have there been times, where being a journalist first, archaeologist second, has posed ethical challenges for you as to whether to step in or not?
Right. I generally have a policy where I don't report on my own excavations. Right. I leave that to others. I don't tend to, because I have very firm opinions that I am allowed to express as somebody, as a supporter of archaeology. I do not, I can't give equal time to illegal artifact smuggling. I can't give time to religious fundamentalists who destroy buildings. So I tend to feel very comfortable about how I work, because archaeology tells the story of the human journey, and journalists also tell the story of the human journey. It works well together.
A reminder that you can ask questions via Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2017. This question, what is the most severe punishment for someone found to have looted artifacts for display or sale?
Right. This is a problem because, particularly in the United States, we tend to issue fines, because some of it is just, our overburdened court system. And you have a federal prosecutor who has a certain amount of time, and they could either prosecute a child molestation case or a drug smuggling case, or try and go after a wealthy person who has brought in a couple objects and has the resources to fight back with all their might. Most of these cases tend to get settled out of court, fines are levied, and they go on. Nobody rarely ever goes to prison. Sometimes you'll see people in the source countries who are active looters go to prison for a little bit, but nothing in the United States. It's a slap on the wrist.
You joined us at the Daily this morning to speak with a team of young journalists there for a few minutes, and in doing so talked a bit about your editorial process, particularly as it relates to your cover story coming out in December. Could you talk a bit about that editorial process, and specifically this one person asks if you can describe your relationship with your editor?
Yes. So I am writing the cover story for our December issue of this year on the archaeology of Jesus, and what archaeology can inform us about understanding that time and that person. Fortunately, well, number one, my editor has a degree in theology, so he catches any of the instances. But it's a wonderful experience, and because I've been both an editor and a writer, I have been fortunate enough to be, since I've worn both hats, I know as a writer I can't take what my editor does personally. When he comes back to me, I have my first draft in, I get it back from him on Monday. When that shows up on my desk, scrawled with red ink, I'm not going to get upset about it because I know that I've done that too. So I've been very, very lucky to work. I mean, at National Geographic, I work with the cream of the crop. I work with the smartest kids in the room. And it's been a fantastic relationship to have.
Where does archaeology intersect with anthropology?
Well, I mean, you could argue in a sense that physical anthropology is a form of archaeology, but we have a lot of types of archaeology, anthropology, cultural anthropology, right? Where you're studying living beings. But we could use what anthropology teaches us then to better understand, and physical anthropology, Lee. Yep. But we could use that information then to better understand how people may have done something in the past. You know, it helps give us insight. Just like the Garbage Project. It was a mix of cultural anthropology and archaeology in a sense.
We have a few questions asking for your comment on the Hobby Lobby case, where they were in possession of artifacts and I believe, according to this person, recently received a fine of $3 million. Could you comment on that case?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, this happens all the time. The only reason you're hearing about this one is because it's Hobby Lobby. You know, I haven't gotten all the details. Not until I get back to the office and I call, my people at Homeland Security and kind of find out what exactly went on there. But this is a much, much more common event than you think. And a lot of it is just completely brazen and outright, just like the dealer on Madison Avenue who is offering kind of a shopping guide of antiquities you would like stolen. This happens all the time, and a lot of this stuff actually is also in museums. A lot of times museums in the past, particularly in the past, they have not done their due diligence when somebody donates an artifact or they purchase one at an auction. But they're getting better about it. Museums are definitely getting better about it. But Hobby Lobby, unfortunately, this is nothing new. It's not even shocking on the scale of it or the lack of severity with the fine. It's, this happens all the time.
Somewhat related, following up on your presentation, someone from Twitter asks, what happened to the person who stole the sarcophagus and put it in their living room?
Fine. Suspended sentence, and technically I think he was facing house arrest, and then they got rid of that sentence, so he served no time, and he just was fined, I think, just a couple $100,000 for that sarcophagus.
This person writes, why does it make me sad that new technology reveals everything beneath the earth and sea? What happens to mystery?
Well, it still is a mystery because a lot of this technology, it could tell you where to look, but it can't always tell you what exactly you have underneath there. That's where the exploration steps in, and you have to figure out how to get under the sea, how to get underground, and actually uncover whatever signals are being picked up by our remote sensing. So there's still exploration there. It's not all digital driven. It's very helpful. It's like our bone sniffing dogs looking for Amelia Earhart right now in the South Pacific. They're another form of technology.
Another question from Twitter. As an archaeologist, how do you decide what project to work on next? How do you figure out which sites have the most promise?
Well, some of it is just, funding an opportunity where, there's a site that's available that needs to be explored. Some of it is what we call almost like rescue archaeology, where something is being dug up or something is going to be built and you have to go in and investigate it ahead of time. But, archaeologists tend to, focus in certain time periods in certain regions. So if you could raise the money to like mount an expedition, and you get the permission of the government of the country you're working in, I mean, we've got plenty of stuff. And it really comes down to what sort of questions do you want to answer. That helps you select your site. And different archaeologists have different questions.
Is there room in today's world of archaeology for a 76-year-old woman who missed her calling?
Oh. Got enthusiastic there. There is room. There are projects that you could volunteer on, absolutely. And it's not all about digging. You know, we need precise people who could catalog, who could photograph. There are opportunities there, absolutely. So it's not over yet. Go for it. Live your dream.
If sites which have been damaged by war or terrorism become safer, should they be rebuilt? Can they be rebuilt?
This is one of the most vexing questions around this issue. There are people with very firm opinions on both extremes. There are people who want to 3D print monuments and then bring them all over the world. There's people who want to rebuild exactly where they found it. There's people who want to leave the sites empty as a memorial to the crimes that had happened there. And I firmly believe that that is ultimately has to be the decision of the community that surrounds the site. The community that calls that site theirs. The people of Palmyra need to decide whether or not they want to rebuild the temples that the Islamic State destroyed. It should not be any sort of bigger, government. It shouldn't be UNESCO. It shouldn't be a foreign entity. You have to leave this up to the communities that have protected and sustained these monuments, and these monuments reflect the values of that community.
Another question from Twitter. Have you tried using remote sensing and Google Earth data to stay updated on your site in Yemen?
I've tried to. The problem with our site in Yemen is that the sands shift so quickly that after the site was not being actively excavated anymore, it became covered. So usually when I look at it now, I'm just seeing sand. I see a couple of the pillars sticking out, but there's very little that I can find out about it. And even my Yemeni colleagues that are in Sana'a right now, I communicate with them via Facebook, and they don't know what's happening at the site either.
What can we do to protect our antiquities? Tourism is good for the economy, but dangerous for our relics.
Well, I think what we need to do is, particularly in the issue of looting antiquities and the antiquities trade, this is not a supply issue. This is a demand issue. As long as we have people that want to put Egyptian sarcophagi in their living rooms, this is going to continue. What we have to do is make ownership of these types of antiquities as un-PC as showing off your polar bear rug. It's what we need to do.
If the country of origin for an artifact is in strife or at war, where does it go? Is it displayed or stored?
Well, here's the thing, is under law, we cannot display looted antiquities. And there's a lot of legal reasons for this and ethical reasons for this. So they sit in this warehouse in New York City, and items have gone back. We've repatriated items to Iraq, right? And Baghdad seems safe enough. But the problem is that a lot of these countries have also signed international agreements that don't allow items to be stored in a third country for safekeeping. And because these laws were written before we had asymmetric wars, before we had the Islamic State. And I'll give you one example, is Afghanistan. When the Taliban first kind of came up and was marching on Kabul, Afghanis wanted to take the treasures from the National Museum in Parkham in Switzerland or somewhere, and they weren't allowed to under international law. UNESCO said no. A lot of this stuff was illegally smuggled out for safekeeping and then ultimately returned, but a lot of it just fell victim to the Taliban. And these are broad international agreements that need to be revisited because realities on the ground now are very different from the time when these laws were written.
What can the archaeological record tell about human cognitive evolution? What do you make of the Julian Jaynes hypothesis?
Well, this is a little hard because I tend not to go back that far with the archaeology that I specialize in. So I think that's almost even more of a physical anthropology question in a way, because I deal with societies that already have written records, historical records. You know, they're settled. You know, I don't tend to even deal with hunter-gatherers. I deal with people who build cities. So I don't think I'm the right person to answer that question for you, or to give you, you know, an informed judgment on it. I'm sorry.
Have we made a mistake by cutting geography in our school curriculums?
Yes. That's all I can say. Absolutely.
Do you find yourself being overly sentimental of your random household objects?
I am. I completely am. You know, and that's what it is. I mean, it's these you know, these physical objects that are manifestations of like what's important to us and what we represent. You know, I'm sure here around Chautauqua, you walk the grounds and there are physical monuments that reflect your psychic landscape. You remember the porch where something happened here. You know, you walk by the club and you remember your kids going to club. You know, all of these little landmarks. And then, of course, the object, yeah, I'm bad. I am really bad about, oh, I can't throw that away. Doesn't work for me. I have my own artifact collection that I'm very proud of.
Can you speak to the issue of Confederate monuments and the removal of them?
Sure. You know, I think the history of Confederate States of America that is being told now very often omits critical pieces of information about the realities of the Confederate States of America. And you have to kind of really understand what these monuments ultimately represent to people who went to war because they didn't want to get rid of their slaves. That's what it is. And I think how you handle it the way the former Soviet Union has. Take away, you know, statues of Stalin, statues of Lenin. Sometimes they put them in a park, sometimes they go into private houses, but they are removed because it reminds them of a moment in history that they're not necessarily proud of. And that, I think, is the most elegant way to handle this. And I know that everybody's got, you know, different perspectives on the legacy of the Confederate States of America, but it does, what it represents to so many people is so painful that it reaches a critical mass in our communities where the community decides we're no longer preserving this monument, we are removing this monument.
And our last question. In the age of fake news, what is the state of science journalism today?
Science journalism is good. We're doing well. You know, it's not as messy as politics, because the beauty of science journalism is you have, here's a question, here's an answer, here's a provable hypothesis, here's the evidence. There's no two ways around that. I mean, you're always going to get your people who believe that aliens built, you know, the pyramids and, you know, they found Atlantis off the coast of Japan, and that's fine. That's fine. But science journalism is doing really well right now, and it's because of the efforts of places like National Geographic that, make sure that their mission is to get the good science out there and ensure that we're sharing it, not only within a little small scientific community, but with the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kristin Romey.
Thank you. Thank you.